Webinar in our 2021 webinar series hosted by the Wild Ones Ozark chapter. This webinar is being recorded. Afterwards, the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Wild Ones Native Plants Natural Landscapes is a nonprofit organization that promotes environmentally sound landscaping practices to preserve biodiversity through the preservation, restoration, and establishment of native plant communities. Our saying is healing the earth 1 yard at a time. If you'd like to join our chapter, you can go to our website at wildones.org/membership. You can find out more information on our chapter website at ozark.wildones.org. Check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/ozarkwildones, or you can reach out to us via email at wildonesozarkchapter@gmail.com. Coming up next in our webinar series in July, we're going to have Jay Randolph talk about the great restoration work he's doing out at Mastered Prairie at the Barren Grain Golf Course down at Fort Smith. That'll be Wednesday, July 14th at 11 a.m. And then in August, Wednesday, August 25th at 1 p.m., Leslie Cooper with the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership is going to give a presentation on monarch conservation in Arkansas. Our speaker this month is Ryan Diener with Quail Forever. Ryan is the Arkansas State Coordinator for Quail Forever and Pheasants Forever, both organizations for which he's worked more than 10 years. Ryan earned his bachelor's degree in Fisheries and Wildlife Management from the University of Missouri in 2010, and then began working with Quail Forever and Pheasants Forever as a Farm Bill Wildlife Biologist in Northwest Kansas, where he worked developing more diverse seed mixes for conservation reserve programs and other native rangeland settings, as well as working to eradicate the growing infestation of smooth brome through grazing, spraying, and fire. Oh, sorry. Let's see. I'll find where I was here. Sorry about that. I'll let somebody else into the room real quick. After 2 years, Ryan left the high plains of Kansas to move back to his home area of East Central Missouri. Ryan worked with the full array of federal, state, and local programs available in his area to help landowners with projects ranging from glade/woodland restoration, native prairie plantings, native grass grazing projects, wetlands, general wildlife management projects, and pollinator seedings. Native grass grazing and prescribed fire were the cornerstones of his work there. In August 2017, Ryan moved to Arkansas to take the Senior Biologist position for Quail Forever and is now the state coordinator for the state of Arkansas, a partnership position with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. He oversees a team of 12 Quail Forever Farm Bill Biologists that cover the state, working in partnership with the NRCS and the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, as well as a 5-person habitat specialist burn crew in partnership with the Game and Fish Commission. Today, Ryan's going to talk to us about Quail Forever in Arkansas, native ecosystem restoration for thriving quail populations. We're excited to have him here today. And so with that, I will hand it over to Ryan.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate the introduction there. And thank you for having me on. I look forward to giving this presentation and seeing what we can talk about. And if there's any questions today about what we do here in the state and the restoration work that we're trying to work on with private landowners. So as I said, I'm Ryan Diener. I'm the state coordinator for Quail Forever here in Arkansas. And I'm going to talk to you today about native ecosystem restoration for thriving quail populations. So just real quick, little background information on our organization. Quail Forever's mission is to conserve quail, pheasants, and other wildlife through habitat improvements, public access, education, and conservation advocacy. Our model as an organization, it's a grassroots system of fundraising and project development, and we really allow our members to see the direct result of their contributions locally on their landscape or how they want to see their contributions made. We empower those local chapters and our volunteers with the responsibility to determine 100% of how their locally raised funds will be spent. So as a result, those chapter volunteers are able to see the fruits of their efforts locally, while still belonging to a larger national organization with a voice in federal and state conservation policy. But we do empower our volunteers to do a lot of habitat work and outreach and education work within their own local area as well as the state. So we do have some chapters here in the state of Arkansas. For those, in the Wild Ones Ozark area, we have a chapter up there in Northwest Arkansas, as well as one in Boone County and out of Harrison, and also down in Pope County in Russellville, and a few more across the state as well. So they'll be happy to, if you want to reach out to them, they're doing habitat work. These are excited volunteers, and they're happy to help go out and do stuff too. And if you want to become member, our membership, comes with Quail Forever Journal of Conservation and some other perks, just like any other organization does. But nationally, Quail Forever was formed in 2005. This is a group that's also part of Pheasants Forever, which actually formed in 1982. But just today, we're going to talk about Quail Forever specifically. So Quail Forever has 172 chapters in 31 different states, over 16,000 members. We've completed over 13,000 habitat projects and impacting more than 4.6 million acres of habitat. And that's on private lands conservation through both our chapters and our Farm Bill Biologists. Nationally, Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever combined have impacted almost 30 million acres. So here in Arkansas, as Eric mentioned, we do have a team of biologists on the ground. We have 8 Farm Bill biologists, as well as a couple of coordinating biologists. We have Leslie Cooper, who he did mention, who works for us as our monarch and pollinator coordinator. We also have Ryan Parker, who's our grasslands and grazing coordinating biologist, and then the 8 Farm Bill biologists scattered across the state. As a whole, the team, since we've started here in Arkansas in 2007, and this is really only through last fiscal year, so once we get through this month, these numbers will be updated, but through the first 3 years of having folks on the ground here in the state, we've impacted almost 47,000 acres. And that's with a lot of different landowners. We've completed almost 1,300 site visits in those 3 years, written 450 plans for people. And a lot of those acres are being completed through cost share programs through both federal and state cost share programs. So these are acres that are actually going on the ground on private lands to improve habitat and improve the systems we have out here in the state. So with that, we'll jump in and talk a little bit about quail and where we sit right now here in Arkansas. So the northern bobwhite range is pretty extensive. We kind of have the core range that covers about 25 or 26 states, and then they kind of have a periphery where they fluctuate north and south a little bit as well too. Up there in the north and west parts of their range, kind of dependent on years and weather, and have seen a bit of expansion, honestly, in the past several years, farther north and west as well. But Arkansas is, smack dab right in the middle of the range for the northern bobwhite. And here in the state, we have seen a decline. So about 5 years ago, the Game and Fish Commission decided to start to really focus some work and do something about it. And with that, they created these 7 focal landscapes around Arkansas. And if you notice, these focal landscapes mirror pretty much the work area for the Farm Bill Biologist for Quail Forever as well. But so we have these focal landscapes where we're really trying to focus efforts and do a lot of habitat restoration within these areas to really see a dramatic impact on populations of quail. And if we zoom in on that northwest Arkansas focus area, most of these focal landscapes have like a core area within it that we're really targeting a lot of work. And in this northwest part, it's Pea Ridge National Military Park. And then we also look at the other public land holdings in those areas and really try to build out and around those areas to really try to expand that conservation footprint on the ground, because a lot of those areas are getting management. And if we can expand that on private lands outside of those areas, we can have a larger impact on the landscape than just random projects scattered across the country. Although we do, still work everywhere within these counties. So here in Arkansas, much like everywhere else within the range of the northern bobwhite, we have seen a pretty steep and steady decline in numbers. You can see here on the North American Breeding Bird Survey, we've seen a pretty sharp decline starting, about 1980. Saw a big dip, got a little bit of a recovery, but never really recovered fully. And then it's been a pretty steady decline since then, kind of hitting, our lowest points here in the early 2000s, and it's been kind of fluctuating back and forth since then. This current graph only goes through 2014, but We have seen a little bit of a slight trending increase in the past few years, but still not even up to where we were, say, in the year 2001 or 2. So what happened? The real issue here with bobwhite quail in Arkansas, just like across much of the range, is habitat loss. Habitat loss is the largest contributing factor to quail population declines. And quail have always dealt with severe weather and predators and have been able to rebound because they've had quality habitat to sustain populations. But without that quality habitat, populations can't rebound like they did historically to those stochastic events like weather or increase in predators or something like that for a year or 2. So a lot of that habitat loss is driven by a few different things. So urban development is really one of the silent yet major contributors to the demise of quail populations. Urban development consumes on average 46 acres of agricultural land every day. And that can mean farmland, pasture land, hayland, or even forest. So land devoted to most agricultural uses, including timber production or lands left to the forces of natural plant succession, still have the potential to be managed in a way beneficial for quail. But once an acre is lost to urban development, it's really kind of lost forever in their minds. So it's hard to get that back. It's not impossible, but it's very highly unlikely that it'll ever be able to be restored to something that would mimic quail habitat with heavy urban development. A lot of our ag lands here were once considered a stronghold of quail population in Arkansas, but today, with improved technology and dominant market forces, we have a much less diverse and much less hospitable agricultural landscape. So good quail habitat is no longer a byproduct of the way that we farm like it used to be. There's now an estimated 6.1 million acres of cropland in Arkansas. And a lot of times production is really taking priority on these lands. We don't have folks that are doing a lot of fallow fields anymore. Larger agricultural production is the norm. We don't have small fields with fence rows. We're leaving some of our less productive acres and permanent covers kind of diminished over the past years. And these are areas where we can make improvements, but really with this, the saving grace is that with some thoughtful management on as little as 3 to 5% of our agricultural acres, we can have a large impact on wildlife and pollinators and quail. Our grasslands have seen a lot of change here in the state as well. We have about 4.5 million acres in Arkansas that's dominated by intensively grazed cool season grasses and non-native warm season grasses like Bermuda, Bahia, and tall fescue. These grasses have very little, if any, value for wildlife, especially for quail, under intensive grazing, as seen here. Without the proper management, these grasses get very, very thick, and that's kind of the intention of a lot of our grazing regimes, is to make sure that grass stays thick, and that really prevents movement of quail chicks and other wildlife. Doesn't provide a lot of food value, and this type of management naturally begets us like kind of single species systems of these non-native grasses. And then forest land here in Arkansas, we have approximately 19 million acres of forest in the state. What we see here is a pretty well managed open woodland. But habitat degradation has occurred in even our natural forested systems here. So in a lot of places, we've gone from stuff that was open woodland or savanna to severely overstocked woods, where we see cedars encroaching in our woodlands. We have a lot of shade tolerant tree species that are growing up and filling in those spaces that would have historically been very open, oak woodland systems or oak pine woodland systems, as you see in the picture there on the right. So on the landscape, what do quail actually need? It's actually, pretty simple. They need grasses and forbs for nesting and brood rearing and feeding, and they need shrubby cover to be able to escape predators and kind of thermoregulate during the summer and the winter. You know, and if you can remember that, that's what they need: grasses, forbs, and shrubs. And they kind of want all that kind of mixed together in equal parts. We want a nice, diverse grassland system that has a lot of wildflowers and forbs in it. You know, a mixture of perennial and annual things that are attracting a lot of insects, creating a lot of seeds for these birds to eat. And you know, that nice high diversity thing that we're talking about is really, you know, a driving force for the ecosystem as a whole. So plant diversity increases insect diversity, which in turn increases mesopredator and quail diversity and just makes for a healthy ecosystem. And that's not necessarily just grasslands. So we have those same dynamics at play underneath woodland and savanna systems as well. So we still have that same herbaceous cover where it's a mixture of native grasses and native wildflowers and forbs with some shrubby cover packed in here too. So what we're really talking about doing and what we're shooting for across most of the state is kind of that restoration of rare and declining habitats. So restoring woodlands, savannas, glades, and prairies that are currently being unmanaged, like a lot of our woodlands are, especially in the Ozarks and Ouachitas. You know, those unmanaged forested systems have a lot of potential there for restoration. And then we can also manage our working forests like we have a lot of in South Arkansas and to some degree in the Ozarks as well. And the same holds true for our grassland systems. There are definitely remnant prairies out there on the landscape. There are small pocket prairies in the Ouachitas, in the coastal plains, and in the Ozarks that with management and fire and some tree or cedar cutting, we could reopen. There's probably a lot more little pocket prairies out there that we don't know exist that are still there and still capable of restoration. And the same thing goes for glades. We know a lot of the glade systems in the state and where they're at. The Ozarks have a lot of glades, and a lot of that glade restoration work is still out there to be done, and it has a lot of potential for habitat for not only quail but all of our wildlife in the Ozarks as well. So, you know, as we look back through history, we find that you know, these open grassy conditions under the trees was really the natural condition in most of Arkansas. In 1815, the federal government began surveying the entire Louisiana Purchase. They made measurements to witness trees at every section line intersection and took notes along each section line. The most common trees they encountered anywhere above the floodplain were shortleaf pine and white post and blackjack oaks. These trees were also very sparse. A lot of times the distance to the nearest tree may be over 100 feet, but definitely 50 to 100 feet. Whereas today, if you walk out into any piece of woods or along on the landscape in general, you're probably never more than 10 to 20 feet from a tree. And several explorers were traveling the state at the same time, one of which was Henry Schoolcraft in 1818. And as he traveled the Ozarks along the White River, he wrote about the endless seas of wild grass that he encountered and had no problem driving a wagon through the woods. One problem he had was finding enough firewood to stay warm. You can go to a well-used campsite today and find enough firewood for the whole weekend in a matter of minutes. It's kind of hard to imagine how frequent the fire must have been and how few trees there were on the landscape through most of the Ozarks for him to not be able to find firewood, or just, you know, very, very scarce wood laying on the ground at all. So these definitely conjure images that are hard to see, and there's not a lot of places in the state where we can go to even see something like that, or you know, even a semblance of what this might have looked like. You know, a lot of times today, we go out to a piece of woods, especially in the Ozarks. This is a pretty common sight. We see sites that are undergrown with a lot of understory and mid-story trees, very little herbaceous growth coming from the ground of the woods. A lot of it's just leaf litter. If you have small openings or on the edge of the woods, you will see, you know, some wildflowers, some grasses growing, and right now, this time of year is a very good time to notice this. If you drive on a lot of our Ozark roadways at the moment, you can see the native grasses and wildflowers blooming and just, having a great time on the roadside. But that's only because they've been daylighted and they actually have some sunlight hitting around. On these dense forests that have grown up, you don't see those species in there. They're there and they're waiting to be released. But with all that shade from the canopy now, they're not able to really bloom and function as they should be. So what we've seen here in the state is succession of these woodland systems without fire. So succession in the absence of fire. And I think we're all kind of familiar with that idea of succession. So, if we stop mowing the yard, it just grows up in weeds and then brush and saplings. And finally, over time, you would have a forest as a yard if you did nothing. So if nothing's done to prevent that succession, you would eventually get to a state of trees. So when that happens without fire management, as it has in most of our forests, the end product in this area is closed canopy hardwood or pine forest. And if we look at the wildlife species that occupy that acre of habitat through time, we see that each species is present for only a short period of time as that succession happens. So you start down there at the bottom, you go from like an open field or even bare dirt situation where you have killdeer or nighthawks, and you kind of move up through that. And as it's young forest, sparse trees, you get doves and quail, and all the way over towards the end where you have things that really only occupy mature, dense forest stands, like ovenbirds or pileated woodpeckers. So that's a big change. And in this system without fire, you have some fairly hard lines where we have species that absolutely stop using that once it gets to a certain point. And we can see that here. These are pictures taken actually from a single photo point in the Ozarks. You can see the tree there in the top picture. You can see it's marked A up towards the top of that picture from 1966. That same tree is marked A in 1981. That marking is taken off for that 2001 photo, but that is still the same tree. If you look right down through that photo, and you can see the sapling that's coming in kind of in front of and to the right of it as well. But this is the exact same photo point taken over a period of about 40 years. And we went from a system that was basically an open shortleaf pine woodland or savanna to a completely closed canopied pine hardwood forest system with a lot of mid-story and understory trees of species that really weren't historically on that part of the landscape. So we have a lot of red oaks that came in because they can survive shade tolerance, as well as elms and hickories and maples and other things like that. And we went from that open stand with the grassy and forby understory to that closed canopied stand with basically nothing but leaf litter on the ground. That's succession without fire, and especially in the Ozarks. But when we have succession with fire and we maintain that, we get a completely different plant community. We still get all those same dominant tree species that we should have had, that we had historically and should still have now, but we retain the grasses and forbs that we started out with. So the mature forest managed with fire has many more places to live than the one without fire. And if we look at the bird species over time on this acre, we see many more species overlap, leading to more diversity in species at any one point in time. And if you look at where the dove and quail can live, even overlapping with the forest species from the last slide. So in this case with fire, we maintain that system. We maintain an open tree canopy with that grass and forb ground layer, and we have bobwhite quail and mourning doves being able to live in that system the entire time. And we still have a lot of the same forest species. They're occupying that through a longer period of time themselves as well. Now there are some species that do also specialize in those, those dense forest conditions, but on an acre that should historically be open woodland or savanna, the fact that we have those forest species there now is a sign that that system has not been well managed, and it's moved forward in succession to something that it shouldn't be. So those species that really want those dense forests would be able to go find those dense forest stands on like our north and east slopes where they should occur, or down near, you know, streams or drainages. So, and a lot of this has to do with, you know, what our natural fire regime was and what we've lost on this landscape. So through fire scar modeling, you know, we have a lot of professionals that have looked at a lot of fire scars in tree ring data over the entire United States. The vast majority of Arkansas would have existed with 2 to 4 year fire return intervals, with some of the Ozarks moving up to 4 to 6 year. And again, this is historic fire return intervals. So this was average normal fire return intervals prior to settlement of these areas. That doesn't mean that's the same fire return intervals that we can use today to get back to that same state. That's just saying what the fire return interval naturally was in these sites. So the coastal plains and the Ouachitas was 2 to 4 years. Parts of the Ozarks was definitely 2 to 4 years, especially kind of in that White River Hills area where it's real glady and open. You know, that would have been a lot of open glade grasslands along with savannas and open woodlands. And then like maybe the Boston Mountains would have been a little bit longer fire return interval because it's a more dissected landscape. And as an example, I mentioned earlier the Pea Ridge National Military Park. We don't have aerial photos, obviously, from the early 1800s, but we do have some through the 1900s and up to today. So if we look at this one from 1940, you can see on this aerial photo that, you know, there's a lot of crop ground, there's a lot of grassland here already, but you can see the woodlands and where they occurred. You can tell definitely where there's been some chunks carved out. And those carved out chunks likely would have been very open woodland or savanna. But you can see on the hills near that north boundary, see if I can show it with my mouse here, this whole wooded hill system up here, you can see how open those trees are. And there's large gap openings, likely glade or savanna areas, but a lot of these woods are extremely open that you can see from this photograph. They are not close canopy forests. Those are savannas, glades, and open woodlands intermixed together. Likely would have all had, you know, native grass and wildflower understory. A 2015 aerial photograph. All of those woods are now dense, closed canopied. We have a lot of areas that weren't woods that have come back to trees, and both within the woods, and you can see it's gotten darker. That's all cedar encroachment, and anything that was very, very open, or even some of our open fields, all this darker green that you see here, that is all eastern red cedar encroachment. So eastern red cedar is a huge problem in the Ozarks and in a lot of places in Arkansas, but the Ozarks especially. Old fields that have been let go, our open woodlands, savannas, and glades that have been excluded from fire management have seen a huge outburst of eastern red cedar come in. That's a species that is not tolerant of fire, and without fire in the landscape, eastern red cedar has really expanded its natural community range here in the state. But with a lot of work and manpower and good planning, we can see here in the most recent Google Earth image that the National Military Park has done an excellent job in removing a lot of that eastern red cedar. You can see some areas up here that was cedar encroachment, those big glades, and they've started opening up some of the other woods too. And you can tell by the color of the grass here. So, you know, this is the big military park field that's, you know, all a hayed fescue. But you can see underneath these areas where they've taken out the cedars, we're getting that savanna and open woodland structure back. The color of the grass there, that reddish brown color, you can see this over here too in this section of the park, and all this down here, nice open woodland structure. That's all indicative of native grass and wildflower coming back in that herbaceous layer. So the park's done a lot of this kind of in the name of quail, but also trying to restore the military park back to kind of what that landscape would have looked like during the battle that occurred there. So that's kind of their goal for the restoration, but they've done some excellent ecosystem restoration work, and they've really increased their quail and wildlife populations dramatically with what they've been doing. So managing for ecological restoration and trying to do this, with wildlife habitat in mind. And for us, in particular with quail habitat in mind, because it's a good indicator species, and a lot of people really love and have a passion for quail and really want to hear them back on the landscape or see them back on the landscape. So it's important when we're talking about ecological restoration that not every acre of the state will make suitable quail habitat. So, there are certainly true forest ecosystems in the state. So in the Ozarks or in the Ouachitas, those north-facing slopes that would have been wetter, those would have been, true protected backslope forests that would have been denser, not had as much ground flora. Areas like that wouldn't naturally make quality quail habitat. It's quality habitat for other suites of species of wildlife, but not every acre is necessarily going to be great for quail. And trying to manage for what a site should be ecologically will in turn be much easier in the long run and much more beneficial. So if we take one of those northern slopes that ecologically wants to be, kind of closed canopy forest, which is a perfectly great thing. We want those to be well managed and maintained too. But if we took that and tried to manage that as open woodland, or even open it up completely and try to maintain that as grassland, that's going to be very difficult. Those are wetter sites, usually better soils, and they want to grow trees very well. So trying to fight that system and what it wants to be to keep it more open than it wants to be is oftentimes very hard. So ecological restoration and looking at what we want to do on the landscape in terms of the ecosystems that were there can really help make our jobs a lot easier in looking at what we want to do and how hard we're going to have to work at doing it. And then in general, just managing for open woodlands, savannas, glades, and prairies will drastically improve our quail habitat and populations here in the state. So that's kind of that's where we come from as an organization here in Arkansas, and that's what we're trying to do with the habitat work that we're doing on the landscape. We want to look first and foremost at trying to do quality ecosystem restoration with landowners, and knowing that if we do that and do it in the right places, we're going to get quality habitat for quail and increase quail numbers. So just a little background on quail and woodlands and savannas. Quail don't really care about the trees. As long as what they need is present on the site and they have it in an arrangement that is suitable habitat for them, they can live there just fine. So when we look at a quail living in an open woodland or savanna habitat, we find that they take advantage of, pine seeds or smaller acorns when they're available. But those food sources, they're really high quality and help them get through a rough winter. But, a lot of their actual food source is coming from those wildflowers, those seed producing broadleaf plants, and the fact that those are attracting much more insects to that particular area that the quail are feeding on. So that herbaceous layer and getting a diversity of plants on the ground, a diversity of native wildflowers and grasses, is really the key component here. And that's the key component that we look at for actually judging the restoration level of an open woodland or savanna or even a glade too. And to do that, we really need to work on getting more sunlight to the ground. And our goal usually is, wanting to get at least 50% of our sunlight hitting the ground to grow those grasses and forbs and some of those shrub species that we want there. If we have really small trees, like either in a pine plantation or a hardwood system that's been like opened up either with clear cutting or some other system that's regrowing, that's kind of hard. If when you have small trees, you're going to have a lot of trees per acre, but you can still have sunlight hitting the ground. And it's not going to look like what we would normally call a woodland, but that would be the beginning stages of it if that's what that acre should be. But as we get, bigger and larger trees, if we have an actual mature, like for example, a post oak woodland in the Ozarks, and those post oaks are 2 to 3 foot in diameter, we might only have 5 to 10 trees per acre out there. Or if we're in a pine savanna system, you might only have, 5 to 10 trees per acre, maybe up to 15 or 20. But it's drastically different looking. That's that mature savanna or woodland system that we're looking at. So when we focus on doing this type of restoration work, and specifically if we're going to talk about open woodland habitat for a little while, it's all about that development and maintenance. And we need to look at that for doing this woodland or savanna work. We're taking a system in most cases that is overstocked with too many trees and a lot of mid-story and understory trees that shouldn't be there, and working on getting that stand developed down to the correct basal area, the correct number of trees per acre, and then maintaining that, usually with fire. And a lot of this, we want folks to, we really encourage people to get management plans to do this. And we'll go through a little bit of that planning process here in a second. But there's a lot of options for how we can do this too. So ecosystem restoration is not a passive thing in most cases. The state that a lot of our systems are in at the moment, we need to actively do physical management to get these things back to the state that they should be in. If we're talking about glades, woodlands, and savannas, a lot of times we need things like timber stand improvement. There's many ways to do that. Reintroducing prescribed fire, silvopasture, which is oftentimes used just as a thinning mechanism, maintaining those fire breaks, and potentially, if we need it, actually planting something, whether it's trees or herbaceous plants. But we'll talk about that a little bit in a second. So for management plans, it's really important to go get either a forest stewardship plan or a wildlife management plan. There are biologists and foresters available for that. That's what we're here to do. You can feel free to contact us or your game and fish private lands biologist at any time. And we can also work on, a burn plan with you, because burning is very important for these restorations of these sites, and as well as a conservation plan if you're going to be getting into any cost share programs. So part of the planning that we do when we're looking at a property and trying to help us decide and help picture what ecosystems really naturally occurred there, there's a really great new tool out there that everybody has access to. So you can find this on Web Soil Survey. So if you just Google Web Soil Survey, it'll take you to this website. So once you open up Web Soil Survey, it's kind of a mapping system, and you can use this area of interest, this AOI button, and you can draw out, say, your property. And once you draw this area of interest on your property, it'll pull that up. And then if you click on Soil Data Explorer, which we'll go to the next page and show that. So you click on Soil Data Explorer, and it'll pull up your soils map. And if you scroll over on the next set of tabs and click on Ecological Sites, it'll show you this map like this. So ecological sites are largely developed based on the soils and the aspect of a site. So if it's how steep it is, which direction the slope is facing, and the soil types, that'll tell us a lot about the moisture and the direct sunlight on a site. And you click on that view all ecological types or ecological sites info, and then you get to this map. And if you scroll down below that map, and you see the map here at the top of this screenshot, it actually shows you the ecological sites that occur within those different map soils units. So on this site, so this is a site that I just picked. It's actually in Marion County. So it's kind of in that White River Hills area. Typically something that we consider to be a lot of open woodland, a lot of glade habitat. And if you look down here, well, let me go back. So just as reference, so that road that goes past these houses is kind of on the ridge of a hill, right? So most of the slope on this property is kind of southeast facing, but mostly south facing slope. So with that in mind, it makes sense to me that these ecological sites that pull up are almost all woodland sites. You do see here there is an inclusion in one of these, so it could have a protected backslope forest, and that kind of tells us that if that soil occurred on a north facing slope or an east facing slope, you could get a forest condition. But otherwise, if that is on a south or west facing slope, it's going to be woodland or even a glade system. Same thing with this. This entire soil type is all woodland, and this entire soil type is all woodland, even on the protected back slope, which means that that's very, very rocky system, no, very, very little surface soil, to where even on a protected back slope, it's going to be thin trees, a lot of ground layer cover. So here in soil web survey, it'll give us this list of ecological sites. And then if you were to click on one of these, so these are hyperlinks, if you click on one of those links, it actually takes you to a new website that was set up that shows you the ecological site description for whatever that was. So I clicked on that calcareous dolomite upland woodland. As you can see, very, very prevalent site in the Ozarks of North Arkansas. So everything above the Boston Mountains, really there's a lot of potential for this ecological site in all of the northern Ozarks of Arkansas, which very typical. Most of North Arkansas, if it was a south and west facing slope or a ridge top, historically was open woodland or savanna. And on this page, there's a lot of options over here on the left-hand side for scrolling down. If you go down to ecological dynamics, one of the most useful things on here is the state and transition model. So state 1.1, this would have been a chinkapin oak, shumard oak, and fragrant sumac woodland with little blue stem and hairy sunflower as kind of the major herbaceous components. And then a state transition model, this shows you basically like how you would transition out of that reference state, which is what it should be, into maybe what we're seeing now. So if we just have a fire excluded woodland, it would have transitioned over time to post oak with chinkapin and shagbark hickory, ash, and hickory saplings, and sumac. So that's what simply fire exclusion. So that's a situation where we could go in there, do some timber stand improvement to remove those trees that shouldn't be there and start burning that site again. And we could transition that right back up to a good, highly restored open woodland system. It takes a little bit more work if we've also, and this is pretty common in the Ozarks, excluded fire and logged it and or heavily grazed that same woodland. Then we're going to see a larger difference in the overstory tree species. That heavy grazing gets us slightly different things. We'll get coralberry as the major shrub component as opposed to sumac, fragrant sumac. And then we also generally see a lot of eastern red cedar in those situations where we have logged or heavily grazed woodlands. And notice here, if we're in that state, there's no easy path directly back to the reference state. We have to transition that over to a better managed fire excluded woodland and then up to the reference state. So it's just saying that if we're in this state here, if we're in state 3, it's going to be a little bit longer, harder path to get back to fully restored than if we were in state 2. So we have to go up through those states to get back to fully restored states. But these state and transition models can really help us and help you figure out where your ecosystems are on your property, kind of what degradations maybe you've had in the past and how easy it might be to get to that fully restored state. Another nice handy thing is they'll have community tables. So they'll have tables for grass and for species that are commonly present on those sites. And a lot of times we can still find a lot of these grass and forage species presence, especially if you have small openings, small little openings within the woods where you still find a lot of grass and wildflowers. If you go in there and look at these, you'll probably find a lot of these species that they have listed here. But this is a good species list to kind of keep an eye out for on those sites. A different site that we had there on that property was a shallow domite and upland glade woodland complex. Again, very, very prevalent within all of the Ozarks. So that's just a couple of examples of where we can actually find information on the ecological sites that would have been present on a property and how we can get a little more info and really help plan out how to do that restoration for that site. So with that in mind, when we do start doing woodland restoration, it's important to know that these natural woodlands and savannas and glade areas, these are pine and upland oaks. They're very, very adapted to fire. They're thick bark, they resprout. So those species that are up there are adapted to fire and really, really like fire. And that fire is what encourages the good herbaceous ground layer as well. And that herbaceous ground layer in turn makes it even higher quality habitat for quail and all of our other wildlife. So just a couple of examples. We see a thin versus an unthin stand here. This is actually down in South Arkansas, but thin back to a point of more of an open woodland structure versus typical unthinned forest system. Both those sites got burned. Again, remember, we have a lot more sunlight on the thin site than we do on the unthinned site. And after that burn, and this was the first entry burn after thinning, and then just the first entry burn on that unthinned site as well. So after one thinning and one burn, that sunlight hitting the ground can obviously makes a dramatic difference in the recovery of that herbaceous layer. Lots of native broadleaf forbs out there, lots of native grasses coming back in to that site. And a lot of times those species that initially come in are kind of those early successional species, but in most of our woodland settings, those plant species are still there in the seed bank. And with thinning and burning, we can restore a lot of that herbaceous ground layer back to its historic levels without any seeding whatsoever. Those species are there, and given time and repeated fire use, they will come back. Whereas on that unthinned site, after a burn, we do get some response. A lot of it is shrub and hardwood resprouting, not so much, the broadleaf herbaceous plant or grasses coming back in. Without that sunlight, those herbaceous plants just don't have enough to grow, and we still get just those shade tolerant woody sprouts coming back in. So timber stand improvement is an important part of this process, and it can be done with commercial harvest. There are opportunities even in the Ozarks to do commercial harvest, especially with cedar. I know that there is opportunities to actually sell cedar, and you can get cedar harvesters to come out and at least help remove some of that cedar that might be occurring on your property. But in a lot of cases, we do have to do a lot of non-commercial timber stand improvement as well. And that can be anything from hack and squirt. So it's individually chemically treating trees that shouldn't be there, that we don't want there. So those mid-story and understory trees that are shade tolerant and growing in, but shouldn't even occur on that site. Maples, elms, some of our red oak species in these upland woodland sites. So these upland woodlands are usually largely dominated by white oak species like chinkapin oak or post oak, or even some, we can have white oak woodlands on some of our north slopes as well. We can also foliar spray small saplings, or even chainsawing, and there is some opportunity for mechanical mulching if there's no market and we have a lot of small trees or a lot of small cedars to where there's no way to really remove those otherwise too. But again, that timber stand improvement is just one part of the process that we also need to use fire to get there as well. So cedar eradication is probably one of the most common things that we need to have done, and that's whether it's something that should be an open woodland or savanna where cedars have encroached. Cedar encroachment is common on our glades. It's very common on, pocket prairies, or even our larger prairie systems here in the state. Without fire, cedars encroach very, very quickly. And now that we have a larger proportion of cedar on the landscape, they move into areas and populate areas even quicker than they used to in the past. So those cedars come into an area, an old open field, or something that could have historically been prairie. You get a grove of cedars, again, very quickly shade out that understory. We don't have a lot of herbaceous growth underneath. And it's true for these glade sites too. So a lot of times you'll find cedar infested glades in the Ozarks and the Ouachitas, and you might actually find pockets that are so rocky and so dry that the cedars haven't completely encroached it. So if you find these pockets, you can look at that herbaceous layer and see, if it's a little blue stem and there's a lot of glade species of forbs that are still occurring here, that lets you know that, yes, we probably have a cedar encroached glade on our hands. And if we go in there and do that cedar removal or cedar harvest or mulching and fire, a lot of times with glade restoration, if it hasn't been drastically grazed in the past, removal of cedar and some of those other hardwood sprouts that have probably come into, and using fire to manage that system, we can usually fully restore glades just with that. So again, prescribed fire is very, very key to this whole process. Ecosystem restoration here in Arkansas really isn't going to be fully feasible without the use of prescribed fire. Fire was a very primary driver on our landscape historically, and we can do things to mimic fire, but we can never fully mimic it if we're not going to use it. We can certainly do good work and we can do restoration without it, but we can't really truly fully restore a lot of these systems without the use of prescribed burning. It does help with access. You know, the understory dominated by grasses and forbs is something that is much, much easier to attain and maintain once we have it with prescribed fire. And we really should be thinking about short interval fires. Now that we have these woodlands and glades and savannas that have been encroached by hardwood species, a burn regime that, you know, on your particular area might have historically been 4 to 6 years. Well, 4 to 6 years now will get us, you know, a 10 to 12 foot hardwood sapling, which would be a lot harder to kill the fire. So we're really talking a lot of times about shorter interval fires. 2 years is probably right, 3 years at the most. And if we go beyond 3 years, we're going to really lose control of those hardwoods again. So prescribed burning is important, and prescribed burning at short intervals can be very, very important, especially within the first years of restoration of these sites for control of those woody species and encouraging development of that grassy and forb herbaceous layer. But with fire, timing is very, very important. You know, in the Ozarks, our historical fire timing was probably more in that October, November, December timeframe. That late growing season and dormant season fire is very good at removing cedars and a lot of the hardwoods for us that we don't want. It's also very, very good at encouraging that herbaceous growth, especially forbs. So spring fire is kind of typical here. But with a lot of our spring fire, we see, you know, if we have non-native cool season stands, we can set them back with those April and May burns. But February, March, April fires actually thickens up stands of grasses more. So if we have areas that have a lot of grass, but we're not getting the forb component that we want to see, we really need to move more towards that late summer and fall and dormant season burning to increase our native forb component. And really that does a good job at setting back and controlling those woody species as well, that late summer and fall burning or dormant season. And burning absolutely works. So, you know, this is kind of a transition like Savannah glade site in the Ozarks. You can see a stump here from a tree that was removed and treated, so we didn't have to worry about sprouts coming from that stump after we cut it. But so this site was thinned and then had a couple of prescribed burns on it, and the recovery of the herbaceous layer on the site was absolutely phenomenal. But prescribed burning absolutely works, and the seed bank recovered well, and we have a really, really nice looking savanna and glade complex here on the site now. And this site is excellent habitat for quail, as well as for turkeys and deer and rabbits and a lot of other important wildlife, including a lot of our native bees and butterfly species too. So the same concepts go to our grassland and prairie restoration here in the state. We want to look at these sites, any grassland site, if we know or if we suspect that it hasn't had cropping history, there's absolutely some potential for restoring that site. And it might actually be remnant prairie if you occur in a part of the state that had remnant prairies or pocket prairies. We can really look at doing high quality restoration on those sites. So, you know, this kind of old field grassland, but with continued management and fire, we can continue to improve that. And, you know, what we're looking for is these states where we're getting back to a diverse herbaceous layer on that site. That's going to be high quality habitat for a lot of our species that really need this type of habitat. This open grassland, native prairie habitat in the state is by far our most threatened habitat type. And a lot of our grassland and shrubland and savanna species are suffering because of this. So these sites are important, and if we can identify these and try to manage these with a light touch, with fire and maybe some very, very targeted herbicide treatments to remove some non-natives that might exist there. But if there's potential for restoring prairie through management in that way, that's fantastic. But, and when we look at these sites, a lot of our prairies, a lot of our pocket prairies, especially in the Ozarks, they would have been, ridgetop prairies, smaller prairies on thin soiled areas that would have transitioned over into savanna and open woodland habitat. And this type of habitat, especially within the Ozarks and in the Watchtows, would have been preferred and just absolutely excellent habitat for quail here in the state. So you would have had the whole need for a quail within their life cycle would have been right here, on something like this that would have been a 20-acre site. That grassland and forb component transitioning into shrub, savanna, and woodland habitat, this would have been very prevalent on the landscape in the past in the Ozarks and could be again today, and would absolutely make for excellent quail habitat. But on some of those sites where we don't have that capability, and say it was a crop field or a hay field or a pasture for decades and has been sprayed out and replanted, we do have the option for replanting that. Those old fields, pasture sites, log decks maybe that have had heavy disturbance, things that have been food plots or fire breaks for a long time. We can do replantings, and we do focus a lot of our replanting efforts now on doing very high diverse mixtures. So we're talking 60 to 65 species, usually at a minimum, on the seed mixes that we recommend now. Still not getting anywhere near the diversity that a native prairie would have actually had, but increasing that diversity of the seed mix on the front end generally increases the diversity of that stand further down the line. And it's going to better mimic, as to the best of our ability, better mimic a prairie than a lower diversity or a cheap, a super cheap seed mix that might only have, 5 or 6 grasses and a few forbs in it. So we do focus on a high forb component, a lot of forb species, and a little bit lower on the grass, because that grass will always increase over time. And those types of plantings often, look like something like this. So this was kind of a pocket prairie planting. This picture was taken prior to that woodland that it's next to being thinned and burned. So that woodland now is a very, very open woodland stand. The species in the woodlands came back just fine, but this site had been hayfield for decades, had been spread out and converted to non-natives. The bottom part of it was actually cropped. It had terraces. So we did go in here with a high diverse seed mix and replant this, and then also managed, that natural woodland ecosystem that was still intact, just overgrown directly next to it. So doing that good, ecosystem restoration to a degree, but being that our grassland systems are have very much disappeared off the landscape, having those open fields and being able to do some prairie recreation work is very, very good. And it's a good use of those open lands that we have currently that could be returned to a more natural system. So just a few take-home points. If we're talking about quail and the quail habitat, grasses, forbs, and shrubs, those are the key things that they need on the landscape. And good ecological restoration does equal good habitat. Not every acre is going to be great habitat for quail, but if you have a property that should be actual forest, so a denser closed canopy forest, there's nothing wrong with managing that acre, that area for closed canopy forest. But then on the other side of that hill, if you own that as well and you have that area that ecologically should be open woodland, then we manage it for that. That's going to be excellent quail habitat. It's going to be excellent habitat for those species that need those open woodland sites that are all, none of those species are doing great at the moment because we've lost a lot of these open woodlands. And then you'll still have those forest species doing quite well over in those forest landscapes as well. So as basal area on a site increases, quail abundance decreases. So, until we get, kind of that at least 50% sunlight hitting the ground, we're not really to a point where we have quail habitat. So that open woodland and savanna structure, those open glades and prairies are extremely important. But if we get to the point where we're up above 50% canopy closure, we really start decreasing in quail abundance. And generally, if we get above 60% canopy cover, quail use basically stops. If we get below 40% canopy cover, which some of these, this savanna glade complex that you see here is definitely below 40% canopy cover, then we can say for sure that that's going to provide quail habitat. With this ecosystem restoration, fire is absolutely key. We really try to encourage use of fire, and we have people on the landscape, and we have prescribed burn associations forming on the landscape to try to help make prescribed fire a more reachable goal for landowners. If you want to try to use prescribed fire, there's more help out there now to help you do that than there ever has been in the past. So please don't write off the use of prescribed fire because you're not sure that you could do it by yourself. You don't have to do it by yourself. There's cost share available to help get it done, and there are groups and people out there to help get it done as well. And then I just kind of always like to say, every time a cedar dies, a quail gets its wings. So cedars are great on those river bluffs and cliffs where they're supposed to be, but cedars in our woodlands and savannas and glades are definitely a huge problem, and we need to do everything we can to try to control those. And if we could even just get rid of the cedars across most of those woodlands and glades and savannas in the Ozarks, we'd be a lot better off for it. That's all I have for my presentation. I just wanted to end real quick with letting everybody know that you can find Quail Forever in Arkansas on our Facebook page. We always have good posts going up talking about habitat restoration, what we're seeing out on the landscape. We've recently posted a lot of events that we have coming up for Pollinator Week here in a couple weeks in June. Our biologists across the state will be hosting field tours or pollinator walks or wildflower walks that week. So, please go find us on our Facebook page and look at those events. And if you're interested in supporting and you like quail, feel free to get one of the Quail Forever license plates here in Arkansas too, and help support us. All the funds from those license plate sales stay here in Arkansas to help do habitat restoration work here in the state. And with that, I'm done, and I'm happy to field any questions.
Thank you, Ryan. That was great. I like that saying, every time a cedar dies, a quail gets its wings. I chuckled when I heard that. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please enter them into the chat, and we'll make sure to ask those. Looks like we have a couple of comments. Gulazar said, thank you. He enjoyed the presentation, or they enjoyed the presentation. Troy says, great presentation. Thanks for sharing your time and knowledge. Yeah, I definitely appreciate it. The ecological sites on the soil survey, that was new to me. I don't really have to use that with my work, but definitely I think I get some use of that out of that at home. I went and so looking around on that and noticed some of the same species that actually do well at my place were listed in those communities.
Yep. And I know that you've done some of this work in your yard and you've seen some quail, so that's great. But yeah, so that data that's on Web Soil Survey now used to just be within some of the internal systems that we had here at NRCS with our mapping systems, and they could be gotten from some downloadable ArcGIS files, especially for Missouri. And we don't have all the ecological site description stuff done for Arkansas yet, but most of the Ozarks is completed because a lot of the Ozarks have the same ecological sites as Missouri, and Missouri's gotten theirs completed. So if they're in that Ozark range, you generally probably can go look at those and get those descriptions. But it's very handy now that it's on Web Soil Survey, and fairly user friendly. It's not too hard to navigate, but I do believe if anybody wants to try that and they have issues, I think there's a short video that you can actually watch to explain how to do that as well. I was hoping my screenshots helped a little bit, but sometimes it can be difficult to find those buttons.
Yeah, I'm already pretty familiar with it, so I was able to follow along. But yeah, other people, if they're not already familiar with the Web Soil Survey, it's once you get used to it, it's can be a little clunky or slow, but sometimes, but it's a really useful tool. We do have a couple of questions. Alyssa Morrison asks, After the prescribed burns, do forb seeds always have to be cast, or do the forbs ever return on their own?
Right. So it kind of depends on the site. So if we're managing a site that is still currently woods and we're trying to manage it for open woodland and we've gotten it thinned and we do that prescribed burning, you know, you'll want to kind of try to dig in and find out if you can what the site history was there. But generally, if we're thinning out woodlands and burning it, I don't ever go in immediately and seed anything. A lot of times with that thinning and fire, the herbaceous layer does recover very well on its own. There may be some highly conservative species that don't come back, or at least don't come back very quickly. But I generally don't see a need to do plantings on woodlands or glade sites unless they've been very, very heavily disturbed and grazed or potentially sprayed in the past. But that's not super common. Usually you can do the thinning and burning and get those good things back. Sometimes our Savannah sites, it's because they had fewer trees, or especially open fields or old, something that might have historically been prairie, or if it was cropped in the past, those are the types of sites that you would likely need to actually do reseeding on.
Sue Tackett asked, she has 4 acres that she used to burn. Now that there is safety help, is it worth trying to burn again? It's now heavy canopy.
Yeah, it can be. So depending on the species that are there, if you can get a fire to creep through there, you'll thin some of those things back out, or you can certainly go in and remove some of those saplings that have come in the meantime and continue to burn like that. But I'd still say it's absolutely worthwhile, and you'll get a response from it. And that fire will kill some of those small trees that have come in and kind of shaded things out. So it might take a couple burns to get it back to the state where you had it in prior to when you were burning it, but it didn't change that way overnight, and it's not going to change back overnight with just a single fire either. So it's important to keep that in mind. But yeah, I think it's absolutely worthwhile.
Sure. Two of the species that I battle most at my place are tall fescue and then Lespedeza. I know Lespedeza, I understand you're not supposed to burn, correct? It'll make it worse. Is that right?
So it can, if you're not using other control methods. There's some really good research on Lespedeza out of Kansas and Oklahoma, and I've used this method myself in both Missouri and here in Arkansas now. If you burn Sericea Lespedeza about the time that it starts to flower, so like very, very late August or through early September, we actually have seen through research that the crowns of those plants get killed, or those plants have used so much of their energy to grow and start to flower, and they haven't pulled anything back to the roots yet, that we have seen an actual decrease in mature plants from September fire on Sericea.
Okay.
And then, but anytime you do burn Sericea, you definitely scarify the seed that's on the ground, and you'll get it to germinate. So if you burn in September and get that seed to germinate, we've also seen those seedlings not be old enough come first frost to survive that. So we've actually seen a decrease in seedlings because they're too young when the frost hits too. Okay. Generally, the idea of not burning Sericea because you increase it is absolutely true. If you're going to burn in the spring, scarify the seed, and you promote that seed, that Sericea germination. But I've also gone ahead and done that too. If it was a field that had a lot of Sericea in it, I intentionally try to germinate that seed with a spring fire, but then I'm going back in that summer and spraying that Sericea. So using fire to get more of it to germinate is a good way to help work through that seed bank faster, but you have to also use herbicides or mechanical treatment to kill those plants after they come up too.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard that those seeds can stay in the seed bank for a long time. So yeah, just going ahead and exhausting it. Yeah, sounds like that'd be much easier than fighting it year after year. What about, I mean, since I know that I was going to try burning the fescue, but I wonder too, if, since traditionally I've been, weed whacking a lot of stuff that I don't want. what would weed whacking or taking a, weed eater to the Lespedeza right when it flowers have the same effect as burning it? Just curious.
It won't have the same effect. You could probably, you would keep that stem from hopefully producing seed. So that plant's going to resprout
Okay.
and try to still produce seed. But if you cut it off at that time of the year, you might keep it from producing seed, but it will try to still. But I don't think you would have the actual impact of killing any of those mature plants with that.
Okay.
But yeah, to me, the key with Sericea is trying to keep it from going to seed every year. And generally that's some kind of mechanical treatment or chemical, and then kill the mature plants that you can, which is generally mechanical treatment. I do a lot of that with spot spraying if I can, but Sericea is fairly allelopathic. So if you're, just for info for folks out there, if you have a field, and it's not uncommon to have a field that's pretty much solid Sericea, or maybe a mixture of Sericea and fescue, you're not going to have a lot of native stuff growing in there anyway. And you can certainly treat that Sericea. And if you have that in a spot that you want to try to maybe get natives into, I would definitely start with a broadcast spraying to hit the Sericea, and then start burning and hopefully be able to spot spray, and do that on the front end, so you have the ability to do the spray treatment without hurting any potential natives. And then you can move to spot spraying after that, so you can start to increase the diversity of the stand at the same time. But I've had stands that were solid Sericea and really didn't come back to much of anything, or it was Sericea, and then after the burning, we'd get like ragweed and mare's tail, our typical annuals that it doesn't really matter if we spray and kill them too, because there's tons of that seed also in the seed bank. We're never going to get rid of those species, but I've taken a field of solid Sericea and spraying and burning it every year to work through the seed bank. I've gone from solid Sericea to simple spot spraying in a period of 4 years. So I've taken something from solid Sericea to 4 years later, I'm still having to go out and spot treat Sericea stems, and it's search and find for them. But I'm at a point then where I can feel comfortable replanting that to native grasses and forbs, and I'm not going to have to spray so much that I can't have those out in the field as well.
Okay. So what's the best time to burn for fescue?
So I've had good luck in the Ozarks burning to set back the fescue dramatically in very late April.
Okay.
If you have indications that your field has some natives in it just waiting to be released, if you have a few clumps of native grasses out there already, I've had very, very good luck in the third, even the fourth week of April, burning off that fescue field. The fescues are going to be greening up, and probably the new growth is going to be 8+ inches tall, but you have last year's dead growth to be able to carry that fire. So it's going to be very smoky, very nasty fire going through that fescue. But I've seen it really set that fescue back at that time, and then the natives have come on very, very well after that, especially native grasses. With that timing of burn, you're going to get a strong flush of native grasses. But I've seen that in an instance where I know it had been planted to natives, but over a period of 20 years had reverted almost completely back to fescue. We burnt that one time on April 25th, and on the 10-acre field, there might have been a dozen clumps of big blue and Indian grass in the entire 10 acres. We burned it once on April 25th, and by the end of that summer, that entire field was solid Indian and big blue stem. It was amazing, and that might not happen in every case, but I know that field had been native grasses before. So it was there and ready to take over when it got burned out. That's probably not going to happen that well every time, but yeah, that late April timing is a good timing for setting back fescue.
So will that fescue try to come back the following cool season?
It probably will to some degree. It won't come back as strong if you if you get a good flush of native stuff, even if it's native annual broadleaf and grasses, let that develop over time. But if you let that cover stay on top of the ground to where the fescue has to fight up through cover to grow, it's probably not going to come back as strong.
Okay.
So fescue eradication with fire alone, I think, is possible, but it's possible over a period of years.
Okay.
It's not in most cases going to be a single application.
Gotcha.
But if you did that every other year, if you had fescue come back in and had to hit it again in April, I think eventually over time your natives will outcompete that if you continue to set back the fescue.
Okay. Cool. Well, one final question. Lisa is also asking, what herbicide do you use for Lespedeza?
Okay, so the best herbicide that we have for treating Sericea, in my opinion, is Pasture Guard. So it's Pasture Guard HL. That if you're spot treating, I believe, and I'll say this right now, you should always read the label to make sure. And it's been a few years since I've been a field biologist myself. I sit in an office and supervise people now, but I believe it's like a ½ ounce per gallon for spot treating Sericea if you use Pasture Guard HL. And it actually has a higher efficacy. You get like a 95 to 98% kill using Pasture Guard versus if you just use regular like Remedy or Triclopyr, you're only getting 85 or so, plus you have to use like 1.5 to 2 ounces per gallon of that chemical. So that Pasture Guard HL is a slightly different formulation. It does a lot better. Now that is a chemical that will kill any broadleaf that you spray it on. So you want to try to do spot treatments with a hand applicator, but it works well. It won't kill any native grasses. So if you have a field of Sericea and you want to have at least some natives out there, you can absolutely plant native grasses and still use our common chemicals to treat Sericea, but have native grasses out there and you won't hurt them.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you, Brian. We really appreciate it. This has been a lot of great information. And yeah, I'll be probably reaching out when it comes time to do some burns at my place. Just pick your brain on maybe a few more things before I try to do that. But yeah, I want to thank everyone.
Sounds
again
good.
for
Happy
being
to help.
here. Yeah, we're really glad that you volunteered your time to teach us, to share your knowledge and these resources to help these landowners with managing their property for quail. Again, the recording of this webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if you've not subscribed to Wildlands Ozark chapter on YouTube yet, please go ahead and do that. Our next presentation in July is going to be on Wednesday, July 14th at 11 a.m. Jay Randolph is going to give presentation on the work he's done out at Massard Prairie in Fort Smith to restore it from golf course to native prairie. Again, you can join the Ozark chapter by visiting our website, wildlands.org/membership. You can visit our chapter website, ozark.wildlands.org, for resources on how you can incorporate native plants into your landscape and gardening projects. So check us out on Facebook, Ozark Wildlands, or feel free to email me at wildlandsozarkchapter@gmail.com. Again, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.